Central Mexico, October 9, 1847. As the streets of the small town of Huamantla erupt in violence around him, Texas Ranger Samuel Hamilton Walker fires with a revolver in each hand into the hordes of oncoming Mexican soldiers pouring towards him. Walker and his fellow Texas Rangers are attached to General Winfield Scott's U.S. Army under the moniker of the 1st Regiment of Texas Mounted Rifle Volunteers. They are assisting in efforts to finish the Mexican-American War against the legendary General Santa Anna's already beleaguered forces. While they are all veterans of vicious close-quarters combat, Walker and his Ranger cohorts are not soldiers in the conventional sense. They are countrymen in the U.S. Army and naval forces who have traveled and fought with them hold the Rangers in a class all their own, a distinction imbued with equal parts fear and respect. In the 2 decades since their inception at the behest of legendary Texas statesman Stephen F. Austin, the Rangers have built a reputation as perhaps the fiercest force on the frontier to combat the incessant murder and raiding that plagued the central Texas countryside at the hands of tribes like the Comanche, as well as horse and cattle thieves. They have also combated Santa Anna's forces before, 10 years earlier, during the fight to annex Texas from Mexico in the Texas Revolution. It is said that a Texas Ranger can, quote, ride like a Mexican, trail like an Indian, shoot like a Tennessean, and fight like the devil. But, in conjunction with the nationwide regard for their bravery and fortitude in warfare waged on the absolute bleeding edges of the frontier, they have also amassed another reputation, one that casts the average Ranger as a ruthless, trigger-happy brute, one averse to all manner of discipline, and completely devoid of any notion of mercy or humanity. Tales abound, even in these relatively early stages of their existence, of the Rangers' unparalleled predilection for abusing and often executing the prisoners that they had taken before ever presenting them at trial. It was said that a Ranger would sooner hang a man than feed him as a prisoner, and oftentimes this adage had proven true, as the nature of the warfare being conducted on the Texas frontier did not, by and large, draw men who were naturally prone to the order and discipline of conventional warfare in the 19th century. They had been designed to be a highly mobile attack force, meant to combat the masterful Comanche, who had for so long decimated conventional military attempts to unseat them as the dominant power in Texas. The nature of this warfare and the nature of the men fighting it had often resulted in scenes of murder, mutilation, and unjust arrest and imprisonment that had driven Santa Anna himself to declare the Rangers as no better than pirates and brigands and refused to grant them any quarter should they be taken prisoner. The general was not only appalled by the Rangers' reputation and their actions against his men in battle, but also their clear lack of cohesion and traditional discipline. Even their physical dress and appearance itself often drew his ire and disgust. The Rangers did not wear uniforms, with each man donning the clothing he thought most practical, comfortable, and, of course, stylish. Jim Gillette, a Ranger who served in the 1870s, gave a description of the typical Ranger dress that recalls that there is, often, no uniformity in the manner of dress, for each Ranger is free to dress as he pleases, and, in the garb experience has taught him most convenient for utility and comfort. A Ranger, as any other frontiersman or cowboy, usually wears good heavy woolen clothes of any color that strikes his fancy. Some are partial to corduroy suits, while others prefer buckskin. A felt hat of any make and color completes his uniform. While riding, a Ranger always wore spurs and very high-heeled boots to prevent his foot from slipping through the stirrup, for both the Ranger and the cowboy ride with the stirrup in the middle of the foot. This is safer and less fatiguing on a long ride. For arms, the Ranger often carried a Winchester rifle or carbine, a Colt .45 revolver, and a bowie knife. 2 cartridge belts, one for Winchester and one for revolver ammunition, completed his equipment, and so armed, he was ready to mount and ride. But, for all their apparent lack in traditional discipline, the Rangers have proven to be unparalleled in their effectiveness on the battlefield. In a world where the conventionalities of modern warfare had been cast aside in favor of sheer, unfettered brutality, they have managed not only to survive, but to thrive. They are also fiercely loyal to their leaders, men who have risen through their ranks through years of hard trekking, riding, and fighting. And among this group of large, unshaven, unruly, and often violent men, it is no small wonder that the quiet, clean-shaven, and smartly dressed 30-year-old Samuel H. Walker has earned the highest level of respect and regard through his bravery and leadership under fire. In the eyes of many of the younger Rangers, Walker is a living legend. Born in present-day Greenbelt, Maryland, Walker had enlisted with the Washington City Volunteers in 1836 and served in the Creek Campaign in Alabama. He had come to Texas in 1842, arriving at the port of Galveston. Here, he had served under Captain Jesse Billingsley in combating the forces of Mexican General Adrian Wall. As part of the infamous Mier Expedition, Walker had been part of a legendary event, one that would cement the animus between the Rangers and their Mexican counterparts for decades to come, when he and 242 other Texans had been captured by Mexican forces at the Battle of Ciudad Mier on December 26, 1842. They had been marched to Mexico City, and on February 11, 1843, 181 of the Texans had managed to briefly escape. But 176 of them, including Walker, had been recaptured. The now enraged General Santa Anna had ordered every one of the 176 Texans to be executed by firing squad. However, diplomatic efforts by foreign ministers from Great Britain and the United States, still a separate country from Texas at the time, had prevailed in convincing the general to execute only 1 out of every 10 of the prisoners. Thus, General Santa Anna revived the macabre practice of the decimation punishment employed by the Roman army. To determine the prisoners to be executed, the Mexican officers had placed 159 white beans and 17 black beans in a jar. The Texans were made to each draw a bean from the jar, with those who drew a white bean being left to live, and those who drew a black bean being designated among the unfortunates to be brought in front of the firing squad. Walker had, in fact, been among the fortunates to draw a white bean, but had been permanently enraged by both the executions of his friends and the treatment of himself and his fellow Texans afterwards, as they were impressed into work gangs and made to build roads around Mexico City. Walker and his companions, including other future Texas Ranger legends like Bigfoot Wallace, would not be released until September of 1844. Many of them, Walker and Wallace included, would return to Texas, only to enlist with the Rangers in hopes of exacting their retribution upon General Santa Anna and the Mexican army. Samuel Walker had enlisted at the end of 1844, and initially served with distinction under the legendary Captain Jack Hayes, himself a rare exception to the hard-bitten Ranger stereotype, before rising to the rank of captain himself. Walker had distinguished himself not only through his actions on the battlefield, but for his innovations in what would go on to become one of the most legendary sidearms in the history of the Old West. In 1846, Walker had traveled to New York City on a self-funded trip to meet with the weapons manufacturer Samuel Colt. Colt was a Connecticut-born inventor whose 5-shot Colt Patterson revolver was being used by the Rangers to revolutionize tactics and techniques in fighting the highly mobile Comanche. Before the advent of the Colt Patterson revolver, so named for its inventor and its birthplace in Paterson, New Jersey, the Rangers had been relegated to single-shot rifles and pistols. The Comanche, able to unleash several arrows a minute from atop their notoriously quick and agile horses, had oftentimes been able to overwhelm and decimate Texan forces who found themselves essentially defenseless after firing their initial volleys. With the Colt Patterson revolver, Jack Hayes, Samuel Walker, Bigfoot Wallace, and the McCulloch brothers, Ben and Henry, had revolutionized the fight being waged against the Comanche by employing far more aggressive tactics enabled by the volume of fire they were now able to produce with their 5-shot revolvers. Though not the first revolver in history, the Colt Patterson would prove to be one of the most influential. Weighing in at a hefty 2 pounds 12 ounces, the single-action revolver measured a total length of 13 3/4 inches with a barrel length of 7.5 inches, firing a 28 or 36 caliber ball with an effective firing range of roughly 59 meters. Though only boasting a 5-shot chamber, the increase in firepower from its predecessors in the Texans' single-shot pistols was exponential. But, though they had been used thus far to great success, the Colt-Paterson revolver still presented a number of issues that rangers in the field found cumbersome to deal with. Though it indeed enabled a greater rate of fire, it had to be loaded by detaching the cylinder, then placing 5 bullets inside and reattaching the cylinder before closing the weapon and carrying on the fight. However, Samuel Colt, living on the East Coast, had no way of knowing of the ranger's specific needs in weaponry. That is, until he began to receive letters from Samuel H. Walker, suggesting improvements that might be made to the weapon. Eventually, a friendship between the two men had developed, resulting in Walker's 1846 trip to New York. After meeting with local officials and even President James K. Polk, who had personally requested to speak with the renowned Ranger captain, Walker had spent several days poring over the details of Colt's revolver design and suggesting improvements he believed could make an immediate difference for himself and his cohorts in the field. What resulted was perhaps the most well-known, influential, and impactful sidearm in American history, the Colt Walker Revolver, or, as most would come to know it, the Walker-Colt. Boasting a new 6-shot cylinder, the Walker-Colt weighed in at 2 pounds heavier than its predecessor at a hefty 4.5 pounds. It measured 15.5 inches in length with a gun barrel length of 9 inches and fired a 44 caliber ball with an effective firing range of 100 yards. In comparison to the sidearms carried before it, the Walker-Colt all but amounted to a small hand cannon with its size, weight, and firepower. To commemorate his friend's contribution to the design and the Ranger's contribution as a whole, Colt had included an engraving of the 1844 Battle of Walker's Creek, in which the Rangers had used their revolvers to turn the tide against the Comanche in a bloody fight in the Texas Hill Country just north of San Antonio. Walker would return to Texas and then on to the Mexican-American War, where he and the Rangers would fight first on the Rio Grande with future President General Zachary Taylor before heading south to join forces with General Winfield Scott in Veracruz. The first shipment of his signature revolvers would be shipped to him only 4 days before the fight that now rages in the streets of the city of Huamantla, providing the 30-year-old captain with a much-needed lift in morale, as he and his Rangers fighting in conjunction with conventional American forces had, thus far, proved a trying affair for both parties. General Winfield Scott, a former lawyer who had served as an officer in the United States Army since the War of 1812, had been appointed as the commanding general of U.S. forces on this campaign south into Mexico. Though he had a complicated and conflict-ridden relationship with President James K. Polk, Polk had deemed it necessary to advance American forces past the Rio Grande in order to break General Santa Anna's forces and usurp the Mexican government. General Scott, ever a prescient career military man, had preemptively drawn up invasion plans that he presented to the president and was granted command of the invasion as he had devised the blueprint for it himself. Serving under the general on this mission would be a litany list of American officers who would, 14 years later, go on to play pivotal roles in the American Civil War. They included Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, George B. McClellan, George Meade, P.G.T. Beauregard, Joseph E. Johnston, and Jefferson Davis. Scott's plan of attack was to sail his forces to the Mexican port at the city of Veracruz, land his forces, and make the roughly 250-mile march west to the capital of Mexico City. A longtime career officer, General Scott insisted on employing strict military discipline on his campaign, a familiar order of affairs for his experienced officers, but one that was largely unfamiliar and palpably uncomfortable for his newly acquired Ranger forces. The Rangers' reputation as outlaws and guerrilla fighters had already caused them considerable consternation, as reports from General Zachary Taylor on the Rio Grande had remarked that, quote, The mounted men from Texas have scarcely made one expedition without unwarrantedly killing a Mexican. The constant recurrence of such atrocities is my motive for asking that no more troops be sent to this column from the state of Texas. But, while Taylor's reports are largely based on hearsay, it is this very reputation as ruthless, unconventional frontier fighters that makes them suited to land with General Scott's conventional forces and scout the hundreds of miles of perilous hills and roadsides, all swarming with guerrilla fighters and army lookouts, from Veracruz to Mexico City. Taylor's admonitions had, in fact, ultimately necessitated Jack Hayes's direct intercession with President James K. Polk, in which a deal was struck that allowed 2 regiments of Rangers to incorporate into the existing U.S. Army Command, officially to be known as the 1st Regiment of Texas Mounted Rifle Volunteers, with Hayes serving as colonel and Samuel Walker as lieutenant colonel. Walker and his men would be tasked with providing security for the critical supply line as Scott and his forces advanced upon Mexico City. But it would be here that Walker would clash with one Colonel Francis Murray Wynkoop. Wynkoop, a devotee of General Scott's strict conventional military style, would repeatedly find himself at odds with the headstrong Rangers, foremost among them Samuel Walker. In the first of such incidents, Wynkoop had ordered Walker's advance guard of 50 Rangers to retreat back to Wynkoop and his men's position in case of an ambush amidst the hilly country. Walker had simply refused the order, instead opting to remain out ahead of Wynkoop's forces. Later in the day, the 2 contingents of Americans had indeed been ambushed by 500 Mexican troops under the command of General Santa Anna. Walker and the Rangers had kept this force, nearly 10 times their size, at bay, until Wynkoop and his men were able to reinforce them. Another nearby American unit had also come to their aid and driven off the Mexican soldiers after a 2-mile running gunfight. While Walker and his Rangers had perhaps played the significant role in combating and thwarting the Mexican attack, Wynkoop, nonetheless, had remained incensed at Walker's repeated insubordination. Walker, for his part, accused his commanding officer of cowardice. A second incident occurred on the road to Mexico City when Wynkoop had ordered Walker to preemptively attack 2 small villages along the route. Walker argued that the villages were full of non-combatants and posed no threat that warranted an attack. He also, in no uncertain terms, made clear that he, and even his battle-hardened Rangers, took deep issue with the regular Army's practice of looting the civilian populations along their route to Mexico City. Wynkoop, indignant at a charge made by the leader of a group that he considered as little better than criminal vigilantes, had confronted Walker, and the 2 men had nearly come to blows. After being separated by the other men present, Walker and his Rangers were ordered to proceed to the nearby Chapultepec Castle, which was being used as the Americans' field headquarters. Here, Walker was stripped of command and confined to his quarters for his refusal to follow orders. And here, Walker remained, growing more indignant and incensed by the hour, not only at his confinement, but, most of all, at his separation from his command. Meanwhile, during this time of personal animosity and professional vitriol between Walker and Wynkoop, General Scott's forces had reached and eventually taken over Mexico City. More reinforcements had also landed at Veracruz, under the command of General Joseph Lane, and had already begun their march eastwards towards the capital city. However, when General Lane had stopped at the castle to rest and refit his outfit of men on their way from Veracruz to Ciudad Puebla, where a now weakened Santa Anna had fled from Mexico City to take part in a siege of American forces inside the city of Puebla, he had been appalled to learn of Walker's confinement and ordered him to be released and returned to command of his men immediately. General Lane ordered that Walker and the rest of the Rangers would now attach themselves to his contingent, acting in the same capacity as they had for General Scott, as scouts and advanced security forces. The Rangers and Army soldiers had been nearly ready to move out when General Lane received word from one of his many scouts that General Santa Anna was in fact not at the city of Puebla, but instead at the nearby town of Huamantla. With this newly gained intelligence, General Lane had ordered that his men and the Rangers would instead proceed to Huamantla immediately. The Rangers, roughly 200 in number, would ride ahead as the advance force, and they would attempt to take over the city and, if possible, to find and capture or kill the infamous General Santa Anna. They had arranged themselves in lines of 4 and advanced into the city at a full gallop, each man with his saber drawn, searching the city streets and alleyways for any Mexican soldiers. Their charge had been met in force by the mounted forces of Mexican lancers, whose elongated weaponry had wrought havoc upon American forces throughout the whole of the Mexican-American War. The two forces had clashed in the midst of the city, with close-quarters urban warfare unfolding in brutal, bloody fashion, with sabers slashing, lances stabbing, and men falling and dying in the middle of the dusty streets. Samuel Walker, for his part, was now firmly ensconced within his preferred environment. With violence and chaos raging all around him, with buildings catching fire and snipers firing from rooftops and windows, Walker had slashed his way to the center of town, even decapitating an unfortunate Mexican soldier who attempted to charge him. Now, with his pistols drawn, Walker sits astride his trusted warhorse, shouting exhortations and encouragement to his men, who now try to carry out the battle in a systematic fashion, going house by house down the city streets, clearing each building of any of its residents before moving on to the next. As the fight intensifies, General Lane and his men now make their advance towards the city, moving at a rapid clip towards the urban battlescape as shrieks of the wounded, the retort of Ranger revolvers, and the smoke from the flaming buildings fill the air. It seems now that the momentum has swung solidly in the favor of the Americans, as their reinforcements near the city, and building by building continues to be cleared by the experienced, efficient Rangers. Then, just as the Rangers believe the deciding moments of the battle to have been won, a sickening sight befalls their eyes. As Samuel Walker methodically aims and fires his revolvers into a crowd of oncoming lancers, a shot from a Mexican rifle rings out from one of the second-story windows above him. Walker's body suddenly falls limp and slumps out of his saddle, hitting the ground with a sickening thud, audible even amidst the ongoing din of battle. As blood pools in the dirt around him, creating a sickening crimson paste that cakes onto the blood and clothing of his rescuers, Walker is dragged behind a small adobe wall. It is clear to all that he is mortally injured. Still, Walker encourages his Ranger cohorts to fight on, reminding them that General Lane's troops are likely only minutes away. A first-hand account of his final moments from one of the Rangers who served under him during the battle recounts that, quote, "He sunk down immediately and was borne into the yard, the men bursting into tears as the cry spread among them, 'Captain Walker is killed.' Captain Walker directed that we should, quote, 'never surrender,' and died in about 30 minutes. The Rangers do, indeed, continue to fight, many of the young men now nearly overwhelmed with a simultaneous torrent of grief and rage. General Lane's troops soon pour into the city, overtaking the Mexican forces, though narrowly missing General Santa Anna, who manages, again, to abscond into the countryside under the security of his most loyal devotees. The victory for the Americans has been won, and victory for the Americans in the war is now nearly assured. But Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hamilton Walker now lies cold in death, and the Texas Rangers will never be the same. After the battle, despite the notable, highly consequential victory they have just attained, many among the Rangers find themselves too overwrought with grief at the loss of such an admired comrade to indulge in much revelry. Instead, they would steel their already feared resolve, going on to take their vengeance against the local populations on their way to Mexico City before riding into the capital under the command of Colonel Jack Hayes. When Hayes was accosted by a citizen throwing a rock, a Ranger comrade shot the offending Mexican man dead where he stood. The Rangers would go on to fortify their reputation amongst the people of Mexico as Los Diablos Tejanos, or the Texan Devils, as in the coming months they would rule over Mexico City with an iron fist, and the ongoing enmity between themselves and the citizens of Mexico would carry on for decades. After the Mexican-American War came to an end on February 2nd of 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, General Santa Anna would find himself exiled to Kingston, Jamaica for 2 years, before attempting yet another bid to retake control of his beloved homeland. While his comrades continued to exact their revenge on the people they viewed as responsible for his death, Samuel Walker was buried in a small but reverent ceremony in Mexico. The ceremony was presided over by his former professional adversary, Colonel Winfield, who was deeply aggrieved at having not mended his relationship with the legendary ranger before his passing. Walker would later be reinterred in San Antonio at the Oddfellows Cemetery, before again being moved to what is today known as the Alamo Masonic Cemetery in San Antonio. A year before his own death, before traveling to the East Coast, Walker had attended the funeral services of his close friend and fellow ranger, Robert Addison Gillespie, who had been killed in action at the Battle of Monterey. Walker had requested that, should he fall in battle, he be buried next to his comrade in arms. This request was granted, and today the two rangers lie interred next to one another at the cemetery located near the famed Alamo Dome in San Antonio. In the years after the war, the Texas Rangers will find themselves called on again, as the Comanche raiding in Texas will only intensify in the coming years. Many of the young Rangers who have seen action in the Mexican-American War will go on to rise to prominent positions, such as John Rip Ford, Ben and Henry McCulloch, and Bigfoot Wallace. Many of the commanding officers from the U.S. Army forces will also go on to positions of high command in the coming decades, with several becoming generals and 2 becoming presidents. But the countless stories of the conflicts, controversies, and tragedies that surround the Mexican-American War, as well as the stories of the individual soldiers, sailors, and civilians who fought on both sides of the conflict, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button below. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.